Hi everyone, welcome back to Lecture 8. We're going to move on to the next third of the class, starting with the sociological theories of crime today. So the two main areas of theory that we'll talk about today are theories that have to do with the ideas of anomie, and we'll also look at some of the subcultural theories of crime. In terms of how you all did on the first exam, overall, I think that the exam went fairly well. There were a lot of A's and B's in the class, and the average was right around an 82. If any of you have any questions, want to come in and take a look at your exam, please feel free to email me and set up an appointment during my office hours, which are Mondays and Wednesdays from 12:30 to 3. If you can't come in during my office hours, but you would still like to come in and talk to me, just send me an email and we can set up a time to get together. Couple quick reminders for you as we're starting in this next section of the class. Don't forget that by the end of the night tonight, so by 11:59 p.m., when I say tonight, I mean Tuesday night, I need you to submit on Blackboard the character that you've decided to write about from the TV series The Wire for your paper. So there's instructions on how to do that right on Blackboard. You can just submit a couple quick sentences saying, this is my character, maybe a reason behind it, but really the key is just to have your character picked for tonight. So make sure you get that done. Next Tuesday, March 6th, we'll have online class as usual, and the assessment next week is a discussion. I'm giving you a couple extra days to do it, so the lecture is on March 6th, but the discussion, your participation in the discussion isn't due until March 8th. On Thursday of next week, we are not having class as usual. On Thursday, you are going to go to the library, go up to Cook Library, room 526, and a librarian who has worked with this course before is going to get you guys going on getting empirical articles for the paper that you're going to be writing. So usually that's the thing that students have the hardest time doing for this paper. Usually, you guys are pretty good at writing about the character, explaining the theory, but some of you tend to have more trouble with actually finding relevant empirical articles. So that's what this library session is all about. This is mandatory, so please do go. And I think you'll find that it's really helpful just to, again, get you going on your papers. Let me know if you have any questions about that. Okay, so let's move on today. Today we're going to kind of depart from the areas that we've talked about already in this class, and we're going to start talking about the sociological theories of crime. So again, this is a huge area. There's a lot of different theories that fall underneath this sociological area. If you recall from before the lecture, we covered theories that looked at a person's biology. We've covered theories that are interested in a person's psychological makeup. This is a departure from that, and in sociological theories, the main understanding and the main idea behind how crime is caused is that crime comes from our social environments. So in sociological theories, the researchers who do this work are seeking reasons for differences in crime in a person's social environment. Not necessarily looking at individual level differences, but what is it about different social forces that might cause someone or influence someone to commit crime? These tend to be called social process theories because all of these different theories, and again, that word, social process theories, that's a general term that's describing several different theories. And all the theories that go under this heading can be thought of as being theories that are interested in understanding what different types of processes, social processes out there, might be able to explain criminal behavior. So we're going to talk about two of these theories today. Again, these are both examples of social process theories, two of many social process theories. The first two that we're going to talk about today are theories that align themselves with what we call an anomie or a strain perspective, and theories that align themselves with a subcultural perspective. So we're going to talk about these major areas over a couple lectures here. Today we'll talk about these two theories, but you'll see that we're going to talk about social process theories for a couple lectures in this segment because it's a really large body of work in criminology that falls under this heading. And the reason that I've grouped anomie and strain theories and subcultural theories together is these theories all borrow from a lot of the same concepts in how they're constructed and the assumptions that they make about human nature. So let's start out by talking about anomie and strain theory. We talked about the French sociologist Émile Durkheim a little bit earlier in the beginning of the semester. If you recall, Durkheim was the one who talked about crime being normal, crime being a healthy part of everyday society, that we need crime because without crime we wouldn't have things to establish moral boundaries and understand, you know, what's right and good to do by understanding what's wrong and criminal and bad to do. So Durkheim didn't believe, even though he thinks that crime is normal, Durkheim did not believe that all societies are set up in the same way. And therefore, he really didn't expect that all societies are going to have the same crime rates. He was interested in explaining why crime rates might rise and fall in particular times in a society. And what he did in 1897 is he wrote a book called Suicide, in which he attempts to describe and explain various types of suicide. So in and of itself, that doesn't probably sound to you like a book about criminology, but it's one of the chapters in this book that got people very interested. So there's a chapter in the book which he calls Anomic Suicide. And in this chapter, he introduces this idea, this concept of anomie, which he directly relates to crime in society. So let's first start out by talking about what Durkheim means by these two different concepts, strain and anomie. Let's talk about strain first. According to him, when cultures experience strain, this is an episodic thing that cultures and societies can go through during periods of their history. And he defined this idea, what it means for a society to go through a period of strain, as a time period when society is unable to regulate the goals of the people within it. So during periods of strain, which he really felt were episodic, kind of short, relatively short periods of time in a society, this is when, for a variety of reasons, people who grew up and who have lived their lives in a particular social class and become accustomed to specific goals, all of those kind of expectations and goals and aspirations kind of get thrown up in the air. So he described as an example of a period of strain, a society that's going through a revolution or a huge economic upheaval, a time period when people don't necessarily know where they fit in anymore. And it's when society can't regulate the goals of people that people start striving for and trying to achieve things that maybe in a normal situation they wouldn't necessarily be able to do, be able to even think of as realistic. So all of these things, all of these different kinds of examples, things like economic crises, economic booms, government overthrows, he felt that they could put a strain on a society's ability to regulate people's goals. And he was specifically referring to the goals of people from the lower socioeconomic status. So in periods of strain, what happens according to him is what he calls anomie. Anomie for Durkheim is his word to describe the idea of normlessness. So in other words, when a society isn't in equilibrium, norms, kind of social normal actions, normal goals being set, all these kind of norms that people live by break down and discontent arises. So according to him, during these episodic periods of strain, people from the lower classes change their goals. They all of a sudden believe that higher levels of aspirations and goals are realistic and try to achieve them. So this is what he describes as anomie, normlessness, when people are no longer kind of happily going about their lives within their own social class. Um, and for him, this leads to people committing crime because, despite the fact that they might all of a sudden aspire for loftier goals, they really, because of their social position, can't actually get them. So this is going to cause people to experience frustration, which, this was a book about suicide, so this was his way of describing sometimes why people might commit suicide. And he really felt like when a society goes through this kind of a period of strain, all different kinds of social problems can happen, not just suicide. So when you have this normlessness, this anomie happening, this is when all kinds of different types of crimes are going to be a lot higher. So for him, this is how he explains crime trends over time. Now, I always like to model these theories out because some of these concepts might be a little difficult to understand if this is your first time ever hearing about them. So let's take a look at this theory, looking at it from a model. Okay, so here's Durkheim's model to give you a visual idea what his ideas look like. So in this model, what I want you to see is that when strains and stresses happen to occur, this causes a state of anomie in a society. So these are episodic, brief periods of time when stresses and strains can be experienced by a society. It can go into and experience a state of anomie, a state of normlessness, when people are trying to, and especially lower class people, are all of a sudden feeling that they can aspire and strive for goals that their social position traditionally maybe wouldn't allow. So for him, this state of anomie happens because society cannot regulate the goals of its people. And according to him, all different kinds of social problems are going to arise in these episodic periods, things like suicide, deviance, and crime. Now, the key here, what I really want you to get to understand is Durkheim didn't see this process as being a permanent feature of a society. Rather, he thought that periods of strain could explain sudden rises in crime. And when a society kind of returns to stability, he thought that that would probably be followed by crime returning to more of its baseline kind of traditional level. So Durkheim's book that this model that I'm talking to you about came out of was in French in the early 1900s, very late 1800s. So for a period of time, his ideas really weren't discovered by criminologists in America who were starting to do research. But by the early 1900s, when the actual discipline of criminology was starting to emerge in America, so not just as a subset of sociology or psychology, but an actual discipline in and of itself, people began incorporating Durkheim's model into what we now call the classic strain model. So this model that I'm showing you was Durkheim's idea, and it kind of laid the groundwork and got people interested in understanding social level processes that might cause crime. But it's the next person who took these ideas and kind of Americanized him that many people describe as being the person who wrote the classic strain theory. And that is an American named Robert Merton. So he'll be the next evolution of strain theory that we're going to talk about. Okay, so Robert Merton was an American criminologist who had a very long, prolific career writing about how social and structural conditions impact crime in America. So a lot of people think of what Merton did is taking the ideas of Durkheim and Americanizing them, taking those initial concepts and terms and phrases and adapting them and changing them to take into account what might be unique about crime in America. So the theory that he wrote about, and he wrote about this in several papers, is the name of the theory is, according to Merton, was social structure and anomie. It's actually kind of interesting because the word strain isn't even in Merton's own title of his theory, but most people today refer to this theory as the classic strain theory. So whether or not you hear it described as classic strain theory or the theory of social structure and anomie, you should know that we're talking about the same basic theory here that was devised by Robert Merton. Now, a couple things you need to understand about Merton's theory. First of all, this was a macro level theory. What I mean by that is he wasn't interested in individual people's differences in behavior. He was interested in understanding at a macro, societal level why it might be that America specifically has such high rates of crime. So he took Durkheim's ideas and he Americanized them. He brought the concepts over to America. So Merton, unlike Durkheim, did not agree that anomie only occurs episodically. He came to believe that anomie, being in a state of anomie, could be a condition of a society. In other words, he believed that America is an anomic society, that this quality, normlessness, anomie, is a quality, a fixed quality of America. And he thought that because we have that quality, that explains why we have such high crime. Now, what he means by that is, in a class-oriented society like America is, opportunities to get to the top are not equally distributed. This is something you all probably know. The idea that he was trying to describe was, the simple fact is that there are very few members of the lower class that can ever achieve the kind of monetary and power success that people of the higher social classes can get. So, if America were a stable society, according to Merton, there would be accepted goals for each kind of social class and accepted ways to achieve these goals that everyone followed. In other words, for Merton, if we were a society where nobody really tried to rise above their social station, tried to rise above their where they came up, we wouldn't have a problem in this country. But for him, a quality that is present in America all the time is the fact that people believe in this country that they should be able to try to seek and achieve loftier goals than maybe they grew up with. And another quality of America for Merton is that we place more importance and more emphasis in our culture on goals, on things that we should want and get, than the accepted means to achieve them. In other words, it doesn't matter how you get to the top as long as you get there. Even if you have to cheat, commit crime, lie, steal, whatever you have to do, the key is to reach that goal. So he feels like that's a quality, that's a feeling, and a feature of American society, this emphasis on goals over the means to achieve them. Now, because there's so much emphasis on the goals for people to achieve, as a society, for Merton, we're always under strain. Because, especially, and again, he's talking about the lower classes here. This isn't a theory explaining why rich people commit crime. But for him, the inability to regulate the means by which people get their goals is why we are in a constant state of strain in this country. So, as a society, we are under strain because we're unable to regulate the means by which people try and achieve their goals. So in response to strain, according to Merton, in this country, people feel that people want to rise above their social position, reach and seek wealth and success, and they adapt and try to achieve this goal by any means necessary. And that's why we have crime for him. It's because a lot of times what people have to do, the means that a lot of people have to do to get their goals, are criminal. So in the next slide, I'm going to go through the model that Merton talks about, because he doesn't really just stop at this idea of strain. And what he predicts in his theory, that in response to feeling this strain, people adapt in a couple different ways. So let's take a look at the model, and you'll see how it draws on the ideas of Durkheim, but is definitely its own unique theory. Okay, so let's talk about Merton's model of anomie and strain. So, as you can see, right away, Merton starts out his theory by saying that America is an anomic society. An anomie can be an actual quality, stable quality of a society. And in societies that have this state of anomie, they're going to experience a lot of strain because they can't regulate the means that people try to use to get their goals. And because a lot of people experience, especially people from the lower social classes, experience a lot of strain, um, in terms of they have goals and they're trying to get them by any means necessary, they adapt in a number of different ways in response to the strain that they experience to try to get their goals. So for him, this is explaining not just why people adapt to strain and commit crime, but he also explains that not everyone necessarily becomes criminal in response to strain. So let's take a look at some of the ways that he suggests that people adapt. So these are, people tend to refer to these as Merton's 4 adaptations. So the first way that people adapt, according to him, to this feeling of strain is by becoming what he calls ritualists. Now, people that he describes as ritualists are people that tend to accept the means presented to them in society and reject kind of the lofty goals that are out there for wealth and power and success. So he gives an example of this, and I think it's useful to think about it this way. Think of someone who participates in the workforce, but just kind of goes through the motions. Participates in the daily grind, goes to work, makes a small amount of money, doesn't really have any lofty ambitions to rise up through the ranks and get powerful. For him, this is someone who is a ritualist. He's accepted the conventional means to get money, having a job, but he's rejected the idea of trying to rise and be more successful. So this is one way, according to Merton, that some people adapt to this anomic state in America. Again, these aren't really people who he sees as committing a lot of crime, because they don't necessarily have the goals that others do. The second kind of adaptation for Merton are people that he calls retreatists. And for him, these are people who not only do they reject the conventional means to achieving things, but they also reject the goals of conventional society. So these are retreatists because these are people who retreat from normal society. They don't strive for money and wealth and success, and they don't participate in the workforce either. They try to exist kind of on their own. He doesn't really see this as being necessarily a really large group of people. And later on in his life, he talked about the hippie movement in the 1970s and 1960s as being an example of a group of people who he called retreatists, just to give you an idea of what this group, an example of this group. The next way that people might adapt to our society is by what he called, these are people who he called rebels, basically. These are people who, according to Merton, reject the means and goals of society. So they reject the means, conventional jobs, and they reject the goals of society, wealth and power and success. But instead of just retreating, they make their own goals. They make their own things that they strive for, mostly because they're unhappy with our society's goals, and they kind of make their own way to achieve these. The final adaptation that Merton talked about, and really the reason I have it in a different color is, this is the group that he felt was the most likely to commit crime. And these are people that he called innovators. So innovators for him are people who reject conventional means in our society. They reject the idea of getting a normal, non-criminal job. They reject that. But they still accept and want the goals of money and power and success, so they innovate. They get those things by illegal, non-normal, non-conventional standards. So the reason that he calls them innovators is they literally create new ways to get the goals that everyone else wants. So like the rest of society, they want wealth and power and success, but they're not willing to go through a conventional way of life to get it. They innovate and find a new way to do it. And often that's going to mean committing criminal acts. So this is his idea of explaining why American crime is so high, because for him so many people tend to adapt and become innovators. But it's also his way of explaining why so many people don't commit crime. I mean, this is a societal level explanation of criminal behavior, but he wanted to be able to make a case for, he wanted to be able to explain why it is that some people, some large groups in our society, might commit more crime than others. So let's take one more look at Merton's ideas in a slightly different way. And I think that this kind of a graph will just make the ideas behind these different adaptations be a little bit more clear. So if you look at this chart, what I have on each side is whether or not the group accepts or rejects the institutional means that we've set up in this country and the cultural goals. So you can think of institutional means as getting a regular job and cultural goals as things like desiring wealth and power. So obviously, the people who both accept the means and accept the goals in society, those are people who we would consider conforming. I didn't really mention that in the previous slide, but he does acknowledge that there is a very large group of people who want power and success and are willing to go through institutional normal channels to get it. So those are kind of people that he called conformists. Then we have people who accept institutional means but reject cultural goals. So these are the ritualists. Remember, these are the daily grind people, people who just go through getting a job, working there every day, not really trying for anything more. And then the people who reject institutional means are people who he called innovators or retreatists. And innovators, if you remember, are the people that are most likely to be criminal. And that makes sense if you look at this graph because these are people who are accepting and wanting traditional cultural goals, wealth and power, but rejecting traditional channels of getting it. And then finally, the last two, retreatists and rebels, are people that they're either rejecting institutional means, or if you're a rebel, somebody who's rebelling, you're setting up entirely new means, and they're either rejecting cultural goals like the retreatists do, or you're setting up entire new goals. According to him, you could kind of fit everyone in society into one of these types of people.